The night sky has always been my sanctuary, a vast, unbroken canvas of light and mystery. As a child, I spent countless hours lying in the backyard, tracing constellations with my finger and listening to my father talk about the stars. "They've been shining for billions of years, Caleb," he used to say, his voice low and reverent, "and they'll still be there long after we're gone." That thought was comforting then. The stars were always my refuge, even when the ground beneath me crumbled. They had been there when Ellie was born, my daughter, my light, and they were there when she was gone. I used to believe that watching the stars could give me answers, could make sense of the chaos. Maybe that's why I became an astrophysicist. Ellie loved the stars too. Even as a toddler, she'd insist on staying up late just to see them. I remember holding her tiny hand as we stood on the porch, her voice filled with awe as she asked questions I couldn't always answer. "Daddy, why do stars twinkle?" she once asked, and I laughed because it was such a simple question for a child, but so hard to explain. Her room was filled with glow-in-the-dark constellations we'd painted on the ceiling together. I could still hear her giggles when I teased her about putting the North Star in the wrong place. She'd stick out her tongue and tell me it didn't matter because nobody knows where the stars really go. She would have been 10 now, old enough to ask even bigger questions. I used to imagine teaching her about constellations, her face lighting up with wonder as she traced Orion's belt or the Pleiades. Instead, I buried myself in work, trying to forget the hospital rooms, the beeping monitors, the silence when it was over. The stars didn't feel the same after that. The first time I noticed the anomaly, it was a Tuesday. Tuesdays were reserved for late nights at the observatory, analyzing gravitational wave data from our latest telescope array in Chile. Servers processed terabytes of information, monitors displayed intricate graphs, and I could hear the soft shuffle of my graduate assistant Callum moving behind me. For hours I stared at the same patch of the sky, a region in Cygnus we'd been monitoring for potential exoplanets. It wasn't until Callum brought me coffee that I saw it. "There's a gap," I said, leaning closer to the screen. "A gap?" Callum set the mug down and peered over my shoulder. "Right there." I pointed to a section of the star map where a cluster of stars should have been. Instead, there was nothing. No light, no scatter, not even residual infrared. Just a blank, dark void. "That's odd," he muttered, squinting. "Could be an equipment glitch. Want me to recalibrate?" "Run diagnostics," I said, though I didn't believe it was a glitch. The absence was too precise, too localized. I enlarged the image, adjusting the resolution to confirm what I was seeing. Sure enough, the gap was real. An area roughly 10 light-years wide, where the stars had simply vanished. Hours later, after ruling out equipment failure, atmospheric interference and human error, I sat alone in the observatory, staring at the void. There was a protocol for anomalies like this: report it to the International Astronomical Union, submit the data for peer review. But something held me back. The stars don't just disappear. A black hole? No, too small for this scale. Cosmic dust cloud? Unlikely given the uniformity. I even considered alien megastructures, though I dismissed the idea almost immediately. Speculation like that wasn't science, it was fiction. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. Observatories in Japan, South Africa, and Canada were reporting similar gaps in different parts of the sky. Theories ranged from rogue planets to undiscovered dark matter phenomena, but no one had answers. The chatter intensified over the next few weeks as more stars disappeared. The gaps weren't random, they were spreading, forming a loose pattern across the celestial sphere. To the naked eye, the night sky still looked the same, but telescopes told a different story. It was like watching a slow, meticulous erasure of the universe. The breakthrough came on a Thursday. I'd been working with a team in Switzerland to compile data from our combined observations, mapping the regions of the missing stars. It was Callum who first noticed the symmetry. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the screen. "Doesn't that look structured to you?" I frowned, studying the map. The missing regions formed interlocking patterns like the filaments of a spider web. It could be coincidence, I said, though I didn't believe it. It's not, Callum insisted. Look, there's a repeating geometry, triangles, hexagons. It's too precise to be random. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. If Callum was right, and the data suggested he was, then this wasn't a natural phenomenon. Something was creating these patterns. The next few weeks were filled with intense collaboration and analysis. The scientific community was alive with speculation, but the answers stayed out of reach. Theories piled up, some plausible, most absurd. I found myself working 18-hour days, poring over spectral data and running simulations. The more I studied the patterns, the more I realized how vast they were. As the weeks turned into months, the phenomenon began to affect Earth in subtle but undeniable ways. The first signs were minor, slight discrepancies in satellite trajectories, inexplicable glitches in atomic clocks. Then came the gravity anomalies. Seismic sensors detected measurable shifts in the planet's gravitational field, as if the fabric of space-time was being warped. "Do you think it's connected?" Callum asked one morning. "It has to be," I said, though I had no proof. The anomalies were too coincidental, too perfectly aligned with the lattice's progression. My colleagues were less convinced. The scientific community was divided, with some insisting the effects were unrelated. "Correlation doesn't imply causation," they argued, a mantra that echoed in every conference call. The turning point came on a cold, clear night in October. I was alone in the observatory, running a routine survey of the Cygnus region. Outside, the wind howled against the glass dome, rattling the building like a ghost. At first, I thought it was another gap, a region where the stars had disappeared. But as I adjusted the focus, I realized it was something else. Against the backdrop of space, there was a line, a straight, unbroken filament stretching across the void. I stared at it for hours, struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It was a construct, a piece of something larger than I could imagine. By the time Callum arrived the next morning, I'd already sent the data to every major observatory in the world. "We need to map this," I said, my voice trembling with urgency. Over the next few days, the filament was confirmed by multiple sources. It wasn't just a single line, it was part of a vast, interconnected lattice stretching across the sky. The implications were staggering. "What are we looking at?" Callum asked one evening as we studied the latest images. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not random. Someone built this." The realization hit me. The lattice wasn't just obscuring the stars, it was enclosing us. Slowly, methodically, it was forming a barrier around our solar system. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the observatory, staring at the growing void and wondering what it all meant. The stars had always been my refuge, my guide through the chaos of life. But now, as they disappeared one by one, I felt a chill settle over me. The lattice wasn't just a discovery anymore, it had become an obsession. I spent every waking moment chasing answers, dissecting data, and forming theories that dissolved under scrutiny as quickly as I constructed them. Sleep was an afterthought, a thing I sometimes remembered to do when my body demanded it. Even then, my dreams were laced with visions of geometric voids, stars swallowed whole by an endless, invisible hand. By now, the lattice's growth had accelerated. The geometric patterns Callum had pointed out were no longer speculative, they were undeniable. Sections of the sky once teeming with stars were now as dark as ink, and it wasn't just astronomers who noticed. Amateur stargazers posted photos of eerily blank constellations online, their captions full of awe and unease. The media dubbed it the vanishing night, and the phrase spread, a shorthand for the growing cosmic mystery. Despite the public's fascination, most people continued their lives unaffected. The stars were foreign to them, beautiful yes, but distant and irrelevant. They didn't notice the subtle effects creeping closer to Earth. But we did. The anomalies worsened. Gravity fluctuations became more pronounced, throwing satellite orbits out of alignment. Entire constellations of communications satellites were failing, their signals lost as they drifted into decay. I sat in on a conference call with a team from NASA, their voices filled with frustration and fear as they detailed the latest failures. The anomalies weren't just random, they were increasing in frequency and intensity. The tipping point came during a live broadcast. An observatory in Hawaii had been tracking a section of the lattice near the Galactic center, hoping to capture higher resolution images. The feed showed a mosaic of interwoven filaments, then without warning, the image dissolved into static. When the connection was restored, the lattice was gone. The section of sky it had occupied was now a perfect, impenetrable black. It wasn't an absence of light. It was an absence of everything. I couldn't look away from the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. What the hell just happened? Someone in the room muttered. No one had an answer. The lattice wasn't just a passive structure anymore. It was dynamic, adaptive. Callum and I worked around the clock, running simulations and reviewing data from every angle. Theories piled up, each more desperate than the last. Was the lattice siphoning energy from the stars? Was it a defensive mechanism shielding us from some unseen threat? The more we learned, the less sense it made. The gravitational anomalies began affecting Earth directly. At first, the changes were barely noticeable, tides behaving unpredictably, seismic activity increasing in frequency. But soon the effects became impossible to ignore. Coastal cities reported sudden, massive surges in sea levels, flooding entire neighborhoods without warning. In the Himalayas, climbers experienced vertigo and disorientation as localized gravitational fields warped beneath their feet. Governments scrambled to respond, but the anomalies were too erratic to predict. The media fed on the chaos, churning out headlines about Earth's silent war and speculating about the end of days. People panicked. Grocery stores were stripped bare, protests erupted, and conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed the anomalies were the result of secret government experiments. Others believed the lattice was divine punishment. Through it all, I remained in the observatory, glued to my screens. The world outside was falling apart, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The lattice was all that mattered. I was convinced that if I could just understand it, I could make everything else make sense. One night, as I stared at yet another set of data points, Callum spoke up from across the room. "Do you ever think about why?" he asked. "Why what?" I didn't look up from my screen. "Why us? Why now?" He leaned back in his chair. "The lattice could have been in place for 1,000,000 years or longer, and we're only seeing it now. But the timing, it feels deliberate, doesn't it? Like it was waiting for us to notice." I hated how much his words resonated. The thought had crept into my mind more than once, a whisper I kept trying to bury. The lattice wasn't random, it wasn't indifferent, it was precise. "It's not about us," I said finally, though my voice faltered. "The universe doesn't care about us. We're just an accident," Callum interrupted. "You don't believe that any more than I do." I looked at him, but I couldn't find the words to argue. A few days later, we received the first direct evidence of the lattice's nature. The Japanese team had redirected one of their deep space observatories to focus on the outer regions where the lattice had been partially visible. Using advanced spectroscopy and data from existing interstellar probes still active in deep space, they managed to piece together an astonishing picture. The lattice wasn't made of matter as we understood it. It didn't reflect light, emit radiation, or interact with gravity in the usual way. Instead, the data suggested it was manipulating the fabric of space-time, bending it like a vast cosmic origami. Even at a distance, oscillating signals could be detected emanating from the structure, patterns so faint they bordered on indistinguishable from background cosmic noise. When the data was processed, those patterns became impossible to ignore. They resembled a kind of code, something structured. The implications were overwhelming. The lattice wasn't just a physical structure, it was a system, a machine, and machines had purposes. I spent the next several nights analyzing the signal patterns, looking for any recognizable sequence. At first, The data seemed random, a jumble of noise and chaos. But then I noticed something. The patterns were fractal, repeating at different scales. It was as if the lattice was encoding the blueprint of its own construction. "Containment," Callum said one morning, staring at the latest simulation. "That's what it's doing. It's sealing us in." I didn't respond, but his words sent a chill down my spine. The lattice wasn't shielding us from an external threat. It was trapping us. The idea was too terrifying to fully process, but it fit. The lattice's geometry, its expansion, even the anomalies on Earth, they all pointed to the same conclusion. As the days passed, the anomalies became harder to ignore. The stars continued to vanish, their light blocked by the lattice's slow, methodical advance. The sky still held the familiar brightness of the sun by day, but by night, its emptiness deepened. Constellations I had known since childhood were gone, erased one by one, leaving the heavens unnervingly barren. Life on Earth continued without disruption, at least on the surface. The sun still shone and the seasons turned, but there was no comfort in that. The sky no longer felt infinite. It felt small, bounded like a cage with walls too distant to see but close enough to sense. I threw myself into my work, desperate for answers. I spent hours running simulations, sending messages to colleagues, and combing through terabytes of data. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The lattice was too vast, too complex. It was like trying to decipher an encyclopedia written in a language I could barely recognize. The final blow came while reviewing the latest data from the Japanese observatory. The team in Geneva had compiled detailed simulations of how the lattice's signals oscillated through space-time. We were debating whether the patterns could be interpreted as a form of communication when a sudden alert on my console pulled my attention away. "Hang on," I said, scanning the notification. "One of our satellites just dropped offline." The Geneva team fell silent. It wasn't unusual for satellites to go out of service, malfunctions, space rubble, or aging equipment. But this was different. Within minutes, 3 more went dark. Callum was at his workstation, monitoring the anomaly. "It's not just ours," he said, his voice tight. "Reports are coming in from other observatories. Global systems are going down." "How many?" "All of them," Callum said. I stared at my monitor, dread pooling in my chest. Satellites formed the backbone of modern communication. Data relays, weather tracking, navigation systems, even live feeds like the one I was sharing with Geneva. If they were failing on this scale, it wasn't random. As I spoke, the video feed with Geneva froze. The screen flickered, then dissolved into static. "Geneva? Can you hear me?" I called out, my voice sharp with urgency. There was no response. The screen went black and the silence felt crushing in the room. The sky was shrinking. Not physically, of course, nothing so dramatic, but perceptually. Every night I stared through the observatory's main telescope, watching as the lattice drew its veil across the heavens. The stars that once anchored humanity to something larger, something infinite, were nearly gone. The gaps had become black, featureless voids. Constellations faded into unfamiliar strangers. Orion's belt had disappeared entirely last week. Now, even Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, was gone. For someone like me, who had spent his life reading the universe as a vast open book, it felt as though the pages were being ripped out one by one. Life on Earth hadn't ground to a halt, not yet. The sun still shone during the day, the seasons continued, and people went to work, went to school, bought groceries. But the growing absence above couldn't be ignored. It seeped into conversations, the news, the corners of people's minds. There was a strange unease that hung in the air, a sense that something fundamental had been taken from us. I couldn't leave the observatory, not because I was trapped, but because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The lattice consumed me now. Its geometry, its silence, its sheer scale, it was all I could think about. Callum still worked with me, though his patience was fraying. I saw it in the way he hesitated before asking questions or stayed later than he should, fiddling with the same data over and over as though afraid to leave me alone with it. "It's almost done," he said one evening, his voice low as we reviewed the latest maps. He didn't need to tell me, it was obvious. The lattice was nearly complete, its edges tightening around the last visible sections of the night sky. What had once been abstract lines and patterns now formed a cohesive structure, an enormous, unfathomable grid wrapping itself around the solar system. "How much time?" I asked finally. "A few weeks, maybe less," Callum said. "Depends on the rate of expansion." I nodded, but the words didn't fully register. My mind was somewhere else, tracing the lattice's patterns again and again. The shapes weren't random, they couldn't be. They resembled something familiar. Fractals? Neural pathways? No, it was deeper than that. Something embedded in the lattice's very existence. "Caleb," Callum said suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. "Do you ever think about why? Why it's happening now?" I looked at him, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. He had asked me the same question weeks ago, back when the lattice's purpose was still speculative. Back then I'd dismissed the idea as coincidence, a random event we just happened to witness. But now... "I don't know," I admitted. His words hung in the air like smoke, and I hated how much they resonated. The lattice wasn't random. It wasn't a natural phenomenon, some cosmic accident we stumbled upon. It was intentional, precise. But why? I turned back to my console, scanning the latest data from the remaining terrestrial observatories. The lattice's signals, the oscillating patterns we detected weeks ago, were getting stronger, more organized. At times they resembled language, though not one we could understand. Other times they felt like warnings. Callum left not long after that, muttering something about needing sleep. I didn't stop him. The truth was, I preferred the silence. It was easier to think without distractions, without someone looking over my shoulder. During one of these long, sleepless stretches, I noticed that the lattice's geometry wasn't random. It was organic. The patterns it formed mirrored structures found in nature. The branching of trees, the spirals of seashells, and even the synapses of the human brain. I stared at the simulation. The lattice wasn't just a structure. It was alive, or at least something close to it. I called Callum back to the observatory and explained what I'd found. He listened in silence, his face drawn. "You're saying it's... what, sentient?" "Not sentient," I said, though the word lingered in my mind, "but designed. Whatever created this, it's operating on a scale we can't comprehend." He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes was enough. Fear, awe, a realization that the universe was far stranger, far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. The lattice continued its slow, steady advance, blocking out the last remnants of the night sky. Sirius was gone. Vega, even Polaris, the North Star, had vanished. By now, the lattice covered nearly the entire celestial sphere, leaving only a narrow strip of stars visible along the horizon. The world outside was unraveling. News reports spoke of protests, riots, governments collapsing under the weight of fear and uncertainty. People didn't understand what was happening, and those who did were too few to make a difference. The lattice was beyond us, beyond anything we could control or fight. Callum left the observatory for good a few days later. He didn't say why, though he didn't need to. The weight of it all was too much for him. I watched him pack his things in silence, feeling a strange mix of envy and pity. He could walk away. I couldn't. Alone in the observatory, I threw myself into my work. I combed through terabytes of data, searching for answers, for meaning. I ran simulations, analyzed patterns, mapped the lattice's growth. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The lattice was too vast, too complex. It was like trying to read an encyclopedia one letter at a time. One night, as I stared at the simulation, I thought of Ellie. I hadn't thought about her in weeks, maybe months. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and unstoppable. Her voice, her laughter, the way she used to ask me about the stars. "Daddy, why do stars twinkle?" I closed my eyes, the question echoing in my mind. The stars didn't twinkle anymore. They were gone, swallowed by the lattice. And soon, they would be gone forever. I sank back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on me. The lattice was erasing us, cutting us off from the universe, from everything that had ever mattered. A single thought settled into my mind, heavier than anything I dared to admit before. This was a prison. A cage meant not to protect us, but to contain us. But if the lattice was built to shield the universe from us, to keep humanity locked away, then what did that say about who we were? What had we done? Or what did the lattice's creators think we might do? The last visible stars disappeared the next night, leaving the sky a perfect, featureless void. There was no transition, no lingering slivers of light to ease us into the void. One night, they were there, fragile pinpricks barely visible behind the lattice, and the next, the sky was black. Not black like the absence of sunlight, not black like a power outage, but black like a thing that had been erased. I stepped outside the observatory that night, for the first time in weeks, and tilted my face upward. I'd grown accustomed to the night sky as it faded, but this was something else entirely. No stars, no faint glow of the Milky Way. Even the air felt wrong, as if it no longer carried the weight of the infinite. The equipment could still track the lattice. It wasn't invisible to instruments. But to the human eye, it might as well not exist. What was left wasn't a sky at all, just a perfect void where the heavens used to be. I couldn't bring myself to look away. For all my years as an astrophysicist, for all my attempts to unravel the mysteries of the universe, I'd never felt more insignificant. The night sky had always been my anchor, the proof that humanity was part of something larger, older, eternal. Now that connection was severed, and the silence it left behind was deafening. The following days unfolded in a fog. The world didn't end. The sun still rose, though it seemed paler now, less alive. Life continued in its strange, stumbling way, but everything felt smaller. Humanity, for all its arrogance and ambition, was nothing more than a flickering light in a sealed jar. I spent hours alone in the observatory, poring over the lattice's signals. They hadn't stopped. Not entirely, but they were different now. The patterns were tighter, more rigid, as if the lattice was stabilizing itself. The signals no longer felt like warnings or directives. They felt final. Callum was gone. He hadn't come back since the day he left, and I hadn't heard from him since. I didn't blame him. The lattice had taken everything he'd believed in, the promise of discovery, the wonder of the cosmos, and turned it into a cage. What was left for him here? What was left for any of us? I kept working, even as I felt myself unraveling. It was all I could do to keep the darkness at bay. I ran simulations, analyzed the lattice's geometry, traced its growth backward through time. It was an impossible task, like trying to map the branches of a tree by studying the roots. But I couldn't stop. I needed to understand. The lattice wasn't just a barrier, it was a message. Its geometry, its scale, its timing, all of it spoke to a purpose. This wasn't an act of malice or cruelty. It was something more precise, a judgment. We were being quarantined, sealed off from the universe like a dangerous pathogen, a threat to everything beyond our fragile sphere. I stayed up that night, watching the simulation as the lattice's patterns solidified. I could see it now for what it truly was, a living, breathing construct, as intricate as any organism. Its purpose was as clear as its geometry, to contain, to isolate, to protect. The next morning I recorded my final observations. "The lattice is complete," I said, my voice steady despite the weight in my chest. "Earth is enclosed, fully contained within a structure that spans light years. There is no escape, no communication, no connection to anything beyond." I paused, staring at the blinking cursor on the screen. Humanity wasn't imprisoned because of what we've done. We were imprisoned because of what we might do. The words felt like a betrayal, but I couldn't deny them. We had spent centuries searching for life in the cosmos, dreaming of meeting our neighbors, our equals. But what if we weren't equals? What if we were the danger we'd always feared? We were never alone, I said softly, the words barely audible. But we were never welcome. I closed the file and shut off the monitor. There was nothing left to say. That night I walked outside for the last time. The sky was empty, but it didn't feel like night. It felt like the edge of something vast and unknowable, a horizon I could no longer cross. For a moment I thought I saw Ellie standing beside me, her hand in mine, her face turned toward the void. She didn't say anything, didn't ask any questions. She just stood there watching the darkness, waiting for a light that would never come. And then she was gone. I stared at the sky until the cold drove me back inside. The lattice was complete. The stars were gone. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly alone.